Last week, we looked at Israel's major failure, how they refused to go into the promised land. They rejected what God offered them, so he rejected them in turn, so that they would never go in. That generation instead was going to die in the wilderness. But then in what we're going to be looking at today, in Numbers chapter 16 and chapter 17, it shows that this punishment that they receive results in this all too common problem that we have, where people don't like to accept responsibility for what they've done wrong. Instead, they prefer to shift the blame and then even use their failures as an excuse to demand more and to say, well, then you need to do this for me in order to make up for it. And that's what Israel's going to do here. We have to know better than that. We have to be better than that. Remembering that God decides what to give, to whom, how much, and we have to forgo entitlement if we want to escape judgment. So Numbers chapter 16, if you already opened up your Bibles there, you're good to go, but if not, now would be the time to head there or to use one of the Bibles that we have over on the counter there, or even a phone to go ahead and search for Numbers chapter 16. We're going to start with verse 1. It says that Korah, the son of Izhar, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, with Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, and On, the son of Peleth, who were sons of Reuben, took men. And they rose up before Moses with some of the children of Israel, 250 leaders of the congregation, representatives of the congregation, men of renown. They gathered together against Moses and Aaron and said to them, "You take too much upon yourselves, for all the congregation is holy, every one of them. And the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord?" So when Moses heard it, he fell on his face. And he spoke to Korah and all his company, saying, "Tomorrow morning the Lord will show who is his and who is holy, and will cause him to come near to him. That one whom he chooses, he will cause to come near to him. Do this. Take censers, Korah and all your company, put fire in them and put incense in them before the Lord tomorrow, and it shall be that the man whom the Lord chooses is the Holy One. You take too much upon yourselves, you sons of Levi." And then Moses also said to Korah, "Hear now, you sons of Levi, is it a small thing to you that the God of Israel has separated you from the congregation of Israel to bring you near to himself, to do the work of the tabernacle of the Lord and to stand before the congregation to serve them, and that he has brought you near to himself, you and all your brethren, the sons of Levi, with you? And are you now seeking the priesthood also? Therefore you and all your company are gathered together against the Lord. And what is Aaron that you complain against him?" So this attack on Moses and Aaron, on their authority, it's a little bit different than most of what we've seen during the period of the Exodus. And so that is not just the book of Exodus, that's where it starts, but that's Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers now, Deuteronomy as well. And most of the time, when there's a rebellion, it's kind of at large. It's of the people, the entire congregation. So the one exception to that was with Miriam and Aaron, where they kind of rebelled against Moses. But that was also a family issue. Usually, though, it's everybody. And they're pretty disorganized. They're just complaining because things aren't going the way that they want them to. This is different. This is the other leaders of Israel who are now standing up against Moses and Aaron, and they're organized, and they're making a formal complaint and have this hierarchy involved. And the nature of it boils down to two things. There's also an attack that's being made by those two who are mentioned, or three who are mentioned in passing at this point. And they're from the tribe of Reuben, and they have their own problem with Moses, and we'll deal with that in the next section of this. But first, it starts with this guy Korah and these other people that he's gathered together against Moses and Aaron because they're accusing them of taking on too much. That's what they say. You have usurped power. You've taken things, authority that does not belong to you because it should be available to the whole nation. That's what they're saying. God, after all, had said in Exodus chapter 19 that Israel was going to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So they're kind of throwing that back into Moses' face to say we should all be able to take part in this. What's so special about Aaron? Why did you pick him to be the high priest? Any of us could have been. And Korah thinks that he has an especially strong claim to this because he's part of the tribe of Levi also, just like Moses and Aaron was. In fact, he's part of the same clan. He's a cousin. He's part of their family. And so he's saying, why should you and your sons be the only priests? We can do it too. So Moses responds to this by actually not responding immediately. It's another sign of his humility, that he doesn't give an answer right away. Instead, it says that he falls on his face. And when Moses does that, keep in mind, that's not him falling down in order to apologize to whoever's complaining at him, because he never does that. It's him falling down in prayer. He goes to God first in order to see what he should do, in order to make sure that he's on the right track. It's only after that he then has something to say. And it's that there's going to be a test. Yes, we can find out who the Lord wants. Aaron and Korah and these two other people who are trying to make a claim to the priesthood, they would offer incense to God. And then whoever his incense he accepted, that's who the priesthood would go to. So this is how they'll figure it out. Now, this does seem a little bit surprising that they would go for this, because it hadn't even been a year since Aaron's two oldest sons had died when they had offered incense that they shouldn't have, and then fire came from the presence of the Lord and consumed them because they broke the rules. And so you would think people would be a little worried about kind of following in their footsteps. But that might have actually been why they thought they could do this. That had already been a partial rejection of Aaron and his family. They were seeing that as God saying that he didn't want them. And maybe that's why they thought it opened the door for them to try this now. And so they agree. They'll take part in this test. But then after setting it up, Moses also gets to the root of this rebellion, which is really the root of all rebellion, of all sin. What God gives isn't good enough. That's what they're saying. Here we have, it apparently was mostly Levites, and again, Korah as the leader was definitely a Levite. And they have a special place in God's community. They've been set apart as this particular tribe that's going to help the priesthood, but they wanted more. And as Moses points out, by returning their charge on them, they were the ones who took too much by demanding this for themselves, when Aaron had taken nothing and was nothing, not of his own. Rather, it was the Lord who had given. It was his decision. That's who they're defying. So they are putting themselves on very shaky ground here, as are the other people who are involved in this. As I said, that's the tribe of Reuben had some people who were also attacking Moses here, but for a subtly different reason. That's what's in the next section, starting in verse 12. Moses sent to call Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, but they said, "We will not come up. Is it a small thing that you have brought us up out of a land flowing with milk and honey to kill us in the wilderness, that you should keep acting like a prince over us? Moreover, you have not brought us into a land flowing with milk and honey, nor given us inheritance of fields and vineyards. Will you put out the eyes of these men? We will not come up." Then Moses was very angry and said to the Lord, "Do not respect their offering. I have not taken one donkey from them, nor have I hurt one of them." And Moses said to Korah again now, "Tomorrow you and all your company be present before the Lord, you and they as well as Aaron. Let each take his censer and put incense in it, and each of you bring his censer before the Lord, 250 of them. Both you and Aaron, each with his censer." So every man did so, took his censer, put fire in it, laid incense on it, and stood at the door of the tabernacle of meeting with Moses and Aaron. And Korah gathered all the congregation against them at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. Then the glory of the Lord appeared to all the congregation. So Dathan and Abiram, they're coming at this from, like I said, a different angle. And they start by refusing to even respond to Moses when he calls them. They're not going to dignify him with a response. And that's laying the groundwork for saying that his leadership is totally illegitimate. They're claiming they don't have to listen to him. So he's also saying that they should come and present their censers with their fire. Well, they don't want the priesthood. They want to undermine him. Because what they're saying is, this is all Moses' fault. Remember, this is right after their refusal to go into the promised land, which they would have also been involved in that. But they're saying Moses did this to them. It was within their grasp, and he led them away. He chose to go back into the wilderness, also that they couldn't gain independence from him, also that he could stay in charge. And so really what this shows is their plan was to do what they had really tried to do then too, replace him. and then go on an unsanctioned invasion. Moses doesn't want to lead them in, fine, they'll do it themselves. That's what they're setting up, refusing to accept that they had already gotten what they deserved by being forced back out into the wilderness. And then they say this thing that kind of comes out of left field a little bit, out of nowhere, where they mention that Moses is going to blind the eyes of these men. And it's something that Moses never did anywhere else. It's not recorded in the Bible, and he bristles at the idea that he had ever extorted or harmed anybody. That's because this is just a saying. It's a phrase. It doesn't actually mean literally that they're saying you're going to gather all these guys up and then blind them. It's really more like when we say you're going to pull the wool over their eyes. That's what they're talking about. So what they're suggesting with that is that the incense, it was just going to be a trick. The test wasn't actually going to show the will of God, and that's why they're not going to bother to take part. There's no point in it. That's their excuse for not showing up when he calls them. The irony, of course, being they didn't realize they were already blind to what God had done, because they'd put out their own eyes, deceived themselves, not willing to see their own responsibility in this. But Korah and the others, at least, the 250 others, they still leap at that chance to be chosen by the Lord. So they show up for the test, and the Lord's glory does appear in the cloud, but yet again, it's full of threat rather than approval. And there's judgment. That's what we see next in verse 20. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "Separate yourselves from among this congregation, that I may consume them in a moment." Then they fell on their faces and said, "O God, the God of the spirits of all flesh, shall one man sin and you be angry with all the congregation?" So the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the congregation and say, 'Get away from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram.'" And then Moses rose and went to Dathan and Abiram, and the elders of Israel followed him. And he spoke to the congregation, saying, "Depart now from the tents of these wicked men. Touch nothing of theirs, lest you be consumed in all their sins." So they got away from around the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. And Dathan and Abiram came out and stood at the door of their tents with their wives, their sons, and their little children. And Moses said, "By this you shall know that the Lord has sent me to do all these works. For I have not done them of my own will. If these men die naturally like all men, or if they are visited by the common fate of all men, then the Lord has not sent me. But if the Lord creates a new thing, and the earth opens its mouth and swallows them up with all that belongs to them, and they go down alive into the pit, then you will understand that these men have rejected the Lord." Now it came to pass, as he finished speaking all these words, that the ground split apart under them, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up with their households and all the men with Korah, with all their goods. So they and all those with them went down alive into the pit, and the earth closed over them, and they perished from among the assembly. Then all Israel who were around them fled at their cry, for they said, "Lest the earth swallow us up also." And a fire came out from the Lord and consumed the 250 men who were offering incense. Now, the first thing with this is that once more, in judgment, God says that he's going to destroy all of Israel, the whole congregation here. But this is different than on those previous occasions where he had done so, because he doesn't say anything here about starting over with Moses to make him into the father of a nation. So this isn't actually about starting over. Instead, this goes back to his promise to make them die in the wilderness. That's what he's going to do. He's just going to wipe out the first generation immediately, since that was where they were going to be anyway, and then just deal with the second generation from that point forward. Just be done with it in an instant. But Moses and Aaron beg for mercy. They intercede again and acknowledge the Lord as the God of the spirits of all flesh. That's a unique phrase. It's the only place in the Bible that this occurs, where God is called this. And so they are acknowledging the fact, they're bringing attention to the fact that God is the source of life. It all comes from him. And so yes, certainly, if he gives it, he has the right to take it. They just hope that he won't. That's all they're asking for. And not really, again, saying that he can't do what he wants to and that he is right in what he wants to do, but that they're hoping that he will show mercy. And then they suggest that this is different than on some of those previous occasions. Yes, any people is accountable for their leaders. And then it goes the other way around too. Leaders are accountable for their people. So there is a shared responsibility, but this wasn't a national sin. This wasn't everybody doing this. This was about the personal ambition of a handful. Now, as we're going to see, God actually knows better than this. Moses and Aaron aren't exactly on the right track here. But still, he gives Israel a chance by starting with those who are obviously guilty. And then says, those who want to avoid their judgments, well, then don't identify with their guilt. And then Moses goes to the people who really are most responsible, to Dathan and Abiram, and says, you want to make sure there are no tricks? All right then, God will give you a second test. He'll oblige you. And if he has not chosen me, if God had not chosen Moses, then they would die naturally, just like everybody else at some point randomly. But if God had chosen Moses, then the Creator would create something new to destroy them in that instant, which is exactly what happened. They got the incontrovertible evidence that they wanted when the earth opened up and swallowed them. And at that exact same time, when the Reubenites were being punished, so were the others. The fate of Aaron's two sons befell now those who challenged Aaron's high priesthood, as fire came out from the tabernacle to consume them as they were burning their incense. Their rejection of God's choices led to his rejection of them. Suffered once again. That was the fate that they ran into. That's what happens to these leaders who tried to take over from Moses and Aaron in spite of the fact that God was the one who had established them. Then we see what the rest of Israel makes of this when we jump down to verse 41. It says that on the next day, all the congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron, saying, you have killed the people of the Lord. Now it happened, when the congregation had gathered against Moses and Aaron, that they turned toward the tabernacle of meeting, and suddenly the cloud covered it, and the glory of the Lord appeared. Then Moses and Aaron came before the tabernacle of meeting, and the Lord said to Moses, get away from among this congregation, that I may consume them in a moment. And they fell on their faces. So Moses said to Aaron, take a censer and put fire in it from the altar. Put incense on it and take it quickly to the congregation and make atonement for them. For wrath has gone out from the Lord. The plague has begun. Then Aaron took it as Moses commanded and ran into the midst of the assembly. And already the plague had begun among the people, so he put in the incense and made atonement for the people. And the plague stopped as he stood between the living and the dead. Now those who died in the plague were 14,700, besides those who died in the Korah incident. So Aaron returned to Moses at the door of the tabernacle of meeting, for the plague had stopped. It's an incredible act of bad judgment on the part of the congregation. That means the rest of Israel. After everything that had been done here, everything that they'd seen, they still side with the now deceased rebel leaders. They think that's the best way to go here. And it shows that they really were responsible when God had threatened them in the first place. That he would have been right to make all of them face the music for that. And so now he does. He doesn't even wait for Moses and Aaron to argue this time, and there really wasn't anything that they could say. The evidence is just right in front of everybody's faces. And the plague, whatever it was, just starts. But there is still something that can be done. Aaron can't convince the Lord that they should be spared. There's no argument to make, but he can still just ask for it anyway. And so his incense, representing prayer, is a request for mercy, even without a word being spoken. And he takes his censer, which the 250 other potential priests had just been judged for, those rebels, but he has the right to use it because he is God's chosen priest. And so he puts the incense in and burns it and steps out rather than moving away right into the devastation, standing between the dead and the living to ask the Lord to relent on the basis of nothing more than his kindness and the fact that Aaron was the one doing the asking, the one who had been put in that place to seek the atonement of Israel. And so the Lord does show that mercy. Yes, many did die, but many more were spared, and that was more than they deserved, because God did listen to Aaron. And so after this, tied along with it, there's one more test that gets set up. And that's what we find in chapter 17. It says that the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and get from them a rod from each father's house, all their leaders according to their father's houses, 12 rods. Write each man's name on his rod, and you shall write the name of Aaron on the rod of Levi. For there shall be one rod for the head of each father's house. Then you shall place them in the tabernacle of meeting before the testimony where I meet with you. And it shall be that the rod of the man whom I choose will blossom. Thus I will rid myself of the complaints of the children of Israel which they make against you." So Moses spoke to the children of Israel, and each of their leaders gave him a rod apiece, for each leader according to their father's houses, 12 rods. And the rod of Aaron was among their rods. And Moses placed the rods before the Lord in the tabernacle of witness. Now it came to pass on the next day that Moses went into the tabernacle of witness, and behold, the rod of Aaron of the house of Levi had sprouted and put forth buds, had produced blossoms, and yielded ripe almonds. Then Moses brought out all the rods from before the Lord to all the children of Israel, and they looked, and each man took his rod. And the Lord said to Moses, "Bring Aaron's rod back before the testimony to be kept as a sign against the rebels, that you may put their complaints away from me, lest they die." Thus Moses did, just as the Lord had commanded him, so he did. So the children of Israel spoke to Moses, saying, "Surely we die, we perish, we all perish. Whoever even comes near the tabernacle of the Lord must die. Shall we all utterly die?" And so here we have, as I said, kind of a third test for the passages we're reading here today, and the last one, because God doesn't want to have to prove himself in judgment. He doesn't want to be cracking down on the Israelites constantly, and he just wants them to stop arguing and accept his choices. And so he gives them this one last preemptive test. He does it before they start complaining about something new, and by making one chosen staff blossom, he'd prove to them that he had the right and the power to say what goes. And this is maybe a little bit odd for something that seems so comparatively small, but you could argue that this is the greatest miracle of the Exodus period. Everything going back from when we're starting at the burning bush and moving forward from there. And that's because most of the other miracles are acts of destruction. And so whether you're talking about the plagues in Egypt, or you're talking about the Red Sea eventually swallowing up the army that followed them, or even the plague that just fell here, or the fire that came from the tabernacle, something is being destroyed. So people are dying in those. A few, many fewer, are acts of creation, where something new is made. And probably the most important one of those is the manna, how God was miraculously supplying that every morning, except for the Sabbath morning, for the people of Israel to be able to eat as they move through the wilderness. But this one is unique. It's not like anything else that we find, because this is a miracle of regeneration. This is life from death. A lifeless stick not only budded, it bloomed and produced fruit that they could pass around and see for themselves that the Lord's power was absolute. And that is why it has this impact, where they're so terrified at the end of this chapter. It's because they realized what it meant about the God that they had been defying every step along the way. He couldn't only kill them once. He could bring them back and do it again if he wanted to. They could not escape his judgment. So instead, they needed to actually listen to him and respect him properly, which this finally makes them ready to do, at least as it comes to this one issue. It doesn't make everything better, as we'll continue to see as we move through this book, but they know now that, yes, they definitely needed someone to stand between them and the Lord, and they weren't any longer going to try to make that person someone other than his own selection of Aaron. And so this does at least draw the story closed on this. They're going to accept him and his family as the priestly family. But of course, this does also, what we find here, it points forward. And that's its purpose as well. It is not just for teaching a lesson for Israel. It's also about prefiguring, pointing out what Christ was going to be and what his ministry would be. That's really the key thing, as always, to take away from all of this. Because he was going to stand between the living and the dead. like Aaron. Humanity teeters on the edge of eternal death, but the Son came down to stand between us and the grave. In fact, not only between us, but actually to enter the grave, to offer himself, paying our price so that we could find mercy. And while we might be able to debate what the greatest miracle of the Exodus is, there is no debate about what the greatest miracle of all is, which follows this one, because Christ, who accepted death for us, did not remain dead. Like the blossoming rod, he returned to life. And that validates his ministry. And that proves that he is the Father's choice and the Father's only choice to intercede for us, to request our forgiveness, to offer us atonement. And so what Aaron did, it was all pointing forward to what Jesus was going to do. And so we need to learn from what went wrong for these rebels in order to not follow in their footsteps. And for Christians, that does mean, because we have to bear in mind, it was their ambition that led to this in the first place. And so we need to be very careful of not being satisfied with what it is that God gives us. Because sometimes we can struggle with that and look at people who have different ministries, or whether it's not just necessarily things within a church, but just within life in general, and people who have a job that we might prefer more, or a different relationship that we're envious of. If we let those things consume us, then we are asking for trouble. And of course, there's a fine line, because there's nothing wrong with wanting better things than what we have, but where it crosses into envy is where we can't enjoy anything that we have. We can't appreciate what God has given us already. If we can't do that and we're constantly fixated on what somebody else has, then we're not actually appreciating God's choices and what he has given us. And so that's what we don't want to be like this. But of course, the ultimate one that this is pointing to is God's greatest choice of all, which is to offer salvation through Jesus. Many people struggle to accept that God has made that choice because they don't want to admit that they have caused their own suffering. They want to see it as being somebody else's fault. They don't want to acknowledge that God knows better than they do, and they can't stand to say that they're wrong. And so there's two things that they do that are really the same as what the rebels here, Korah and Dathan and Abiram, did. They either try to force God to agree with them by inventing new doctrines for themselves and cherry-picking things out of Scripture in order to try to make it say what they want it to say instead of what it actually does, and that's what Korah did. Or they just refuse to respond to him at all by completely ignoring his word. They can ignore it, but it's not going to change it. It's not going to change what happens to them because of it. The best thing that anyone can do is to see that they're on the edge of the precipice. The ground is open for them. But if they'll lean back on Christ, then he'll make them stand. He'll keep their heads up. That's what people need, rather than just blindly following their own delusions or anyone else who's leading them into destruction. And so I want to invite anybody, whether here or watching online, who's not made the choice to trust in Christ, don't let that be you. God has made up his mind, but has shown that his heart is open to you. And so if you'll stop trying to force your own will on him, if you'll accept that you have sinned, that there are things that you have done that are wrong, that have gone against what God has said to do, and you're accountable for them. But if you'll ask for forgiveness on the basis of what Jesus has done for you, then you'll have life from death forever. Not because you're worthy of it, but because he's merciful. And so I hope that if you've never been at that point, that you find yourself there now, and you can make that decision and open your heart to Christ. For Christians, that is what you've done. And that's the promise. That's what we are waiting on, life from death. Sometimes it's hard to accept the waiting. And we all struggle with that. We have to try to remember that God has shown himself faithful. His day will come. That means so will ours. Until then, we just have to follow him. Listen to him. Be satisfied with the choices he's made and what he's offered us. And then call on others to also respond to this only truth that saves. so that they won't be swallowed up by death.